Welcome to Break the Silence, Build the Future, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the voices of survivors and advocates while shedding light on the pervasive issue of gender based violence. Join us on a journey where survivors find strength in sharing their stories and experts offer profound insight into this critical societal issue. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Break the Silence, Build the Future. Today, I have the privilege and the honor of being joined by Dr. Teresa Rodrigues-Lebron. She is a scholar with a bachelor's degree in political science, a master's degree in public administration, and doctorate degree in philosophy with a specialty in literature from Puerto Rico and Caribbean. She is a lecturer professor for the Criminal Justice and Criminology program in the Academic Division of Liberal Arts at the University and G. Mendes Recanto de Carolina. Her research topics include the manifestation of violence and drug trafficking in the community. Dr. Rodrigues speaks English, but she feels comfortable in expressing and sharing the depth of her expertise in gender-based violence in Spanish. And to that end, we have the help and the generosity of Margaret Villamizar, who is going to interpret for us between English and Spanish. She would listen to Dr. Rodrigues' statements and will interpret what she told us in English. Thank you, Dr. Rodrigues, and thank you, Margaret Villamizar. In today's episode, we're going to look at how events such as war and natural disasters exacerbate the violence against women and girls. And not only that, we're going to look at how people who are already on the periphery of society, already in a difficult situation economically, socially, politically, are hard hit when there is events like war and natural disasters. My first question to you, Dr. Rodrigues, today is, how do you see the relationship or the link or the continuum between segments of our society that are already disadvantaged politically, socially, economically, when events like Hurricane Maria, how does that exacerbate the situations of these segments of women in our society?
Así que tenemos que el perfil de las mujeres que tienen mayor incidencia de escenarios, ¿no?, de violencia de género, son mujeres que de por sí la propia sociedad, el propio sistema la ha empobrecido. Son mujeres pobres.
So as it turns out, the women the who experience the majority of the gender-based violence are people who the society has already placed in a position of impoverishment, and that's the problem, the main problem for them.
Al no tener a dónde ir o tener las facultades para poder tener acceso a herramientas para mejorar sus condiciones, se ven presas, ¿no?, de sus propias circunstancias.
So in addition to not having the means or having the ability to access services or the tools that they need to get ahead, they're kind of like imprisoned by their own circumstances.
Y con la llegada de desastres naturales como el huracán, la pandemia, COVID y la serie de terremotos que vinieron después, este alto por ciento, ¿no?, de mujeres que ya eran vulnerables terminaron siendo aún más vulnerables ante las situaciones de los escenarios de desastre.
So given those conditions, after the hurricanes and the COVID-19 pandemic, and then the earthquakes that followed the hurricanes, these women were even more vulnerable, who already were vulnerable than, before because of these circumstances.
No quiere decir que mujeres de más educación o mujeres de mejor posición socioeconómica no estén expuestas a este tipo de patrón de violencia, pero ciertamente las mujeres con menos escolaridad y las mujeres que tienen a cargo el rol de ser jefas de familia y que viven bajo los índices de pobreza están más expuestas, son más vulnerables.
It's not to say that the lower levels of education is the problem for the women who, aren't able to escape the violence, but their conditions are such, they're head of household without the kind of supports they need that leave them vulnerable, so that they're the ones, and living below the poverty line, they're the ones who are most subject to the violence that we're talking about.
So I want to go back to and revisit the relationship between the struggles that these women face and the natural disasters that Puerto Rico faced, particularly hurricanes Maria and the one that preceded it. So if you could explore with me again about that correlation. The question is the hurricane igniting the situation, or is it there already and we now see it? If we had a woman who lived in this small shack and now the hurricane came and wiped the house away, then now we see it. Is that how it works? Or the hurricane is the starting point for these challenges?
I think it's a combination of both. Como habíamos comentado, Puerto Rico de por sí, más del 42% vive bajo los índices de pobreza. Y lo que hizo el huracán María fue exponer primero esa pobreza y luego que uno ya da cuenta, ¿no? El nivel de pobreza y necesidad que hay, que ya había en el país después del huracán, ante la caída y el colapso del Estado, del gobierno, del sistema. Entonces se acrecenta, ¿no? Se convierte en un problema más grande, más visible y más fuerte de combatir.
So it's really, I guess, a combination of the both things that you asked about. Due to the large number of people who live in poverty in Puerto Rico, what Hurricane Maria exposed was that poverty that may not have been so well known before that. And due to the collapse of the state, of the government, and all the services, it made the problem much more visible, and it also exacerbated it.
Le añade las situaciones como la experiencia que tuvimos del huracán María, donde mucha parte de la población estuvo sin servicio de energía eléctrica por 6 meses, 7 meses, por dar un ejemplo. Este tipo de evento atmosférico genera entonces estrés, tensión emocional, lo que aumenta los factores de riesgo a poblaciones como las mujeres que ya están siendo vulnerables. Y eso fue lo que vivimos.
What again happened with Hurricane Maria, where you had many people without any kind of electricity for 6, even 7 months. This kind of atmospheric event as well created the conditions that were very stressful and high levels of emotional tension amongst the people, which of course put people even more at risk of bad things happening and made them even more vulnerable. So it's a combination of the two.
Que es una cualidad que no solamente se circunscribe al caso de Puerto Rico y el huracán María. En la región lo hemos vivido con el caso de Haití y los terremotos, ¿no? que sucedieron, como entonces las mujeres, nuevamente el factor pobreza, la necesidad, fueron atacadas, asesinadas, inclusive en los campos de ayuda humanitaria.
And it's not only Puerto Rico that this has been happening to. We have in the region, for example, Haiti, where the earthquakes that they've suffered there also affect people who already were impoverished. And you found many women were affected by that particularly. They were killed, they died. And anyway, it was the women again who largely were affected, and Haiti is another example of that.
Así que la relación que existe entre desastres naturales y episodios o eventos de violencia de género, está la violencia, existe el escenario ya, y con los eventos naturales de desastres, lo que se hace es que se acrecenta, se catapulta. La mujer entonces se queda sin acceso a esas ayudas que quizás en una primera parte tenía. Puede ser que esté siendo desplazada de su espacio seguro, de su grupo de personas de apoyo, y queda entonces aislada, lo cual nuevamente continúa redundando en más muertes y más violencia a este campo.
So the relationship is there between these natural disasters and the gender-based violence towards women. It occurs, for example, when people perhaps have lost their homes and they, after some kind of an event like this, have no access to services like healthcare and other things that they may have had before, or their social supports, families and others, they're displaced from those people. And that makes them even more isolated and hence more vulnerable.
In my experience in Canada, at least, and in Somalia, where I lived before I moved to Canada, some of these situations are both predictable and preventable. You could see these things that they're going to happen and who they're going to happen to. So we can predict this will happen, and we could see the risk factors that these women have, whether it's limited education, access, like we have all these inquests, we have inquiries, and those inquiries come up with list of recommendations of what needs to be done. But we just look at them and we don't really act on it. And it's sometimes not even worth the millions of dollars that goes into that research. And when I think about it, we are in 21st century where we should be able to know what community is impacted. Why do you think that idea is not there, since we can predict it to prevent?
Yo entendería que el primer problema que tenemos es que la problemática o la situación de violencia de género, el Estado la ve como una sola cosa, ¿no? Si creo las leyes para, digamos, desde un aspecto penal, nosotros en Puerto Rico tenemos la ley 54, que es la ley de violencia doméstica, que provee, no es una ley especial, que provee, ¿no?, las definiciones y los estatutos para proteger a la población, pero una ley sola, sin el aspecto de la educación, sin el aspecto de poder ir a la comunidad, ir a donde están estas personas más vulnerables y reeducar a la población de que no debe de existir un estigma respecto a lo que es ser víctima de violencia de género, sin el aspecto de la educación, sin el aspecto de estadísticas confiables y sin una política pública que genuinamente entrelaza todos los esfuerzos que se realizan, no vamos a poder nunca tener resultados.
In Puerto Rico, for example, the question of gender-based violence is viewed as kind of a single or a unitary thing. Like there's laws that deal with this, right? We have our law 64, which pertains to domestic violence, and it has definitions and it contains regulations and statutes that call for protections to the women. But without the necessary educational programs, without people going into the communities where the most vulnerable people live, to try and re-educate them so that they're not stigmatized as victims, without reliable statistics and public policies, the problem is not going to be dealt with appropriately.
Se puede seguir, nosotros ahora mismo en Puerto Rico, por ejemplo, el gobernador de Puerto Rico firmó una orden de ejecutiva declarando un estado de emergencia por el nivel de violencia de género. Ese estado de emergencia le permitió a él implementar políticas públicas e inyectar dinero a organizaciones que trabajan con este perfil de la comunidad. Pero es una orden que tiene un tiempo de vigencia y no vamos a poder resolver the main problem, economic backgrounds, education backgrounds. So we will go back to the beginning after the declaration ended.
Recently, the present governor issued an executive order declaring a state of emergency or a state of exception because of the episodes of gender-based violence. And that has allowed him then to implement policies and to give money to groups that are working in services for people who are victims of that. But the problem is it's a time-limited decree. It runs out after a short period of time. So without the educational programs, with the economic conditions to address the problem, it can't possibly fix it.
Until people realize this is a community problem, this is a social problem, not only women's problem, we will keep facing the same wall.
So I want to start with where you had there are programs, because anytime when we have a challenging situation, our reaction is to say how we deal with this particular situation. For example, in Ontario, we had 3 women that were killed by the same man. Then the government has all these initiatives and they have the inquest and they get the report. And then they say, okay, X number of millions is going to go to this community agency, to that community agency. But the effort is never sustained. As soon as it's not on the news anymore, now we're calm, then it tends to die down with the women who are in this situation, and it didn't go away for them. And these agencies have no money anymore. The need is always need for shelter beds, need for counseling, need for safety net, outstrips whatever support that exists in any community. We are not seeing the women's issue as very important. So in Puerto Rico, were there any lessons that were learned about the hurricane and what it exposed that would lead to a step forward in coming up with a sustained services and support system that's connected, instead of having these piecemeal that come up and go down?
Ok. En Puerto Rico nosotros tenemos en el gobierno una agencia específica, se llama Oficina de la Procuradora de las Mujeres, que es la oficina que recoge a nivel nacional todos los esfuerzos y la implementación de la política pública, brinda servicios de consejería, apoyo legal, asiste a las mujeres desde en el proceso del tribunal, da charla, eventos educativos. Ese es el organismo a nivel institucional. A su vez, hay varias organizaciones que trabajan sin fines de lucro, que trabajan directamente con las comunidades, el aspecto, ¿no?, de la violencia de género y el aspecto de salud y el aspecto de derechos de la mujer. 2 proyectos importantísimos que con el huracán María tomaron más fuerza y más visibilidad es el proyecto de Taller Salud y el proyecto Matria. Pero tenemos más de 20 organizaciones de base comunitaria que trabajan continuamente con este tema, brindando apoyo y educación, ¿no?, el aspecto educativo respecto a la violencia de género. Pero nuevamente, estas organizaciones se ven afectadas por la falta de fondos públicos, la asignación de fondos es bien poca y debido a la quiebra que vive el país, todas las agencias como esta, incluyendo la oficial del Estado, ha recibido una disminución significativa en fondos que son los que necesitan para poder salir y trabajar directamente con la población.
In Puerto Rico, we have at the level, at the institutional level, a particular office, Procuraduría de las Mujeres, no? Like the women's, like prosecution brings together all kinds of things for women, like public services, counseling, legal services, and also educational services pertaining to gender-based violence. There are also various other not-for-profit organizations that do work with women and with the communities on those questions of violence, health, women's rights, and so on. In particular, recently there have been 2, one which was like a health workshop, and the other one was called Madria, so like a motherhood. Those are the 2 primary ones, but there are still others that on an ongoing and continuous basis work in the communities, offering support of different types, educational programs, and so on regarding violence. However, the big problem is that the lack of public funds that are provided to the organizations that are doing the work, and that's very much needed. The country's economic bankruptcy dealt a big blow. The budgets are not sufficient for the programs that are needed, so that the funds aren't there to deal with these issues.
It became personal for me when my daughter was in this relationship that she was unable to get out for her own reasons, and I'm trying to find the resources. We realized the services were really disjointed and broken in pieces. There was nothing connected. Also, I realized the services are so rigid and they're not flexible. It doesn't allow to meet your needs and to meet Margaret's needs and to meet my needs. It's set up on a paper and you have to meet the service. rather than the service meeting your needs. So my daughter's partner lived in Detroit, Michigan, which is about from my house to his house, there is 20-minute drive, but we're separated by international border. Therefore, she wasn't deemed at risk. So if the risk assessment is 10, my daughter would get 1. So she wasn't eligible to get into a shelter. She wasn't eligible to get protection. She wasn't eligible to get counseling unless we paid for whatever limited protection existed. She didn't have access to it because of her partner being international. She wasn't deemed at risk. So my question to you is then, how flexible are the programs that support women in Puerto Rico, however limited they are, and rules that govern funding in order to meet the particular woman that's seeking services? Where in Ontario, it's almost you have to meet the program, not the other way around.
En Puerto Rico, primero tenemos a nivel ¿no? legal, como ya había mencionado, tenemos varias leyes especiales que van dirigidas completamente a adjudicarse en un caso penal a esta persona encontrarse de culpable por, digamos, asesinato. Pues no solamente sería por asesinato, tendría como un agravante el hecho de que asesinó a su pareja o expareja, por ejemplo, y eso le suma más años a la condena. Así que a nivel desde una perspectiva legal, pues sí contamos con leyes especiales en nuestro Código Penal que van dirigidas a, así como están los agravantes de crímenes de odio o de poblaciones vulnerables como los menores de edad, pues también hay leyes dirigidas a actos cometidos dentro del marco del femicidio. Ciertamente, uno de los retos más grandes que tenemos es que estas ayudas, por ejemplo, la Procuradora de la Mujer y muchas de estas organizaciones de apoyo, están centradas en la área metropolitana del país. Así que las mujeres que viven fuera del área metropolitana, que viven en el campo, que viven en el área oeste de la isla, no tienen una facilidad para poder accesar este tipo de apoyo y de ayudas. Con la implementación de la orden ejecutiva, los municipios tienen por obligación que tener una oficina destinada a brindar apoyo a las mujeres que son víctimas de violencia de género. Pero al ser un país tan pequeño y tan estigmatizado la situación, ¿no? de lo que es la violencia de género, también está el aspecto de que las mujeres no buscan este tipo de ayuda porque sienten que las van a juzgar o que están solas durante el proceso.
In Puerto Rico, as I did mention, there are certain legal measures. We have various special laws in our criminal code. For example, people are judged for murder, like you mentioned as well, but there's aggravating factors. In this case, for example, if they commit gender-based violence or murder someone, there's a bigger sentence that they can get, more years that they're sentenced for. So there are aggravating factors for other conditions as well, for femicides, right? However, there's a big challenge in that the supports that are available for victims and people who are at risk are centered in the metropolitan areas, leaving people who are outside those areas, in rural areas or maybe in the west of the island, without access to the same level of services and supports that the others have. For example, with the executive order that was recently passed by the governor, it's mandated that in the municipal areas, they all have to have an office for women who are victims of gender-based violence, where they can go to seek help and supports. But in a country like ours, which is small and stigmatized, and this happens often in countries of that nature, women, particularly from, smaller areas or who are not in good conditions, don't go and seek out that help. Don't go to those offices because they're afraid they're going to be judged and what will people say. And so it's a problem on that basis as well.
Claro, es bien importante resaltar que ese miedo, ¿no? que se puede sentir no descansa en el vacío. Ciertamente la comunidad tiende a revictimizar, tiende a juzgar a la mujer que es víctima de violencia de género. Inclusive, lamentablemente, en muchos de estos casos, cuando muere una mujer en manos de su compañero o expareja, la primera reacción de la comunidad es ¿por qué se quedó? ¿Por qué lo eligió? Así que no es, vivimos en esta esfera, ¿no? de estigma, donde le toca incluso a la mujer después de muerta dar razones y defenderse cuando no debería de ser así.
So, of course, this problem that we were talking about doesn't exist in a vacuum where people don't seek out services, right? The communities that themselves where people are living, they tend to reinforce the stigma. They re-victimize people once they've already been victims of a crime. You know, those who are victims of being killed by their partner or their ex-partners, or I guess violence against them by those partners or ex-partners, then they have to answer to the community and others who are saying to things like, well, why did you stay? Why did you not leave? It's blaming the victim again. So even after their death, some of these women are held accountable by the communities that exacerbate the problem again.
También el perfil de las personas que son víctimas de violencia de género, si voy al cuartel de la policía a denunciar, puede suceder que en la policía no me tomen en serio, no reconozcan la vulnerabilidad o en el riesgo en que me encuentro. Y hemos visto casos en el país que inclusive en los tribunales, mujeres como Andrea Ruiz Costa, que fue al tribunal a solicitar una orden de protección, la juez que atendió el caso no le dio mérito a su reclamo y Andrea murió asesinada porque se le denegó su petición de orden de protección.
Another problem is that if I go down, say, to the police station to denounce something that's taking place or a crime that's being threatened or that a woman is at risk of gender-based violence, domestic violence, oftentimes you might not be taken seriously there. They don't recognize that risk and they don't issue orders of protection. There was a case of a woman, Andrea Ruiz Costa, who was murdered. And even the judge, it was a woman judge, I think you said, right?
Yeah.
Who did not issue a protection order that she requested and didn't take it seriously. So these people it's a system also that they are dealing with.
Thank you. That's interesting because when my daughter was killed and I started talking about it in social media, a lot of people, including people that have the same background I do, were telling me, oh, if she would have married, because my daughter's husband was American and she was Canadian and we're from Africa and he wasn't. So the reaction for some people was, if she would have married somebody from her own background, this would not have happened to her. This doesn't happen in our community. It just happens in that community. Why did she marry somebody from the same faith or from the same color or from the same background? That's where people were going, rather than seeing this should not have happened. It doesn't matter who you decided to have a relationship with. So for me, looking at it and experiencing it, I am finding this to be exhausting, trying to advocate. Not only emotionally exhausting, but it's discouraging because you feel like you are working and working and working and nothing is getting done. And even though I just started and nowhere near claiming I'm an expert, but I'm getting all these messages from women who are saying, I'm in this, I'm trying to get out. But my mother says, don't leave your husband. You need to make sure the children are growing up with their father. Or my sister is telling me, every woman struggles. You're not the only one struggling. Why are you complaining? People are telling me, stay, just be patient with him. After he gets a little bit older, he's going to get better. You're too controlling. Don't ask him too many questions. So I get those messages. I'm just thinking, this is really not workable. So when I look at you, you have all these degrees, you have all these educations, and you can work literally anywhere in the world that you want to. Why here and why in this field? What makes you look in this and say, I want to be here, I want to advocate for these women that maybe I have a little bit more voice, maybe I have a little bit more understanding. Why are you in it?
Well, first and foremost, I do really love my country, and I have this strong feeling es como un mandato, yo necesito a nivel que voy adquiriendo mayor experiencia y mayor educación, para mí es devolver a la sociedad que me dio estas oportunidades, how to be better, how to do better. I strongly believe in equal justice. I strongly believe in feminism, in equality. My country ha sufrido muchísimos años de colonialismo, muchísimos años, más de 500 años, ¿no?, de colonialismo, y hay un potencial muy grande en el que podemos desarrollarnos y podemos crear y diseñar la sociedad que merecemos. So for me to stay here significa construir ese país, aportar a construir el país que merecemos.
One of the things at the beginning, when Ana Teresa switched a little bit to Spanish, I think you said it was kind of like a mandate or a mission you felt, I think,
Yes.
right? To give back to my country. I really love my country, is what she had said before, and to make it better. So my country, for example, suffered more than 500 years under colonialism. And it has so much potential. And therefore, my idea is that we have a society that needs to be developed. And I want to contribute to my society in that way, to give back to what I've been able to do by developing and creating the society that we in Puerto Rico deserve.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for saying that. Of course, we can't really talk about gender-based violence or intimate partner violence or violence against women, vulnerable women, without talking about the people it impacts. Can you think of stories that would add to your repertoire of your experience in supporting a woman who is trying to get out or got out and trying to seek support? Can you think of examples of stories of those women that you are in this fight for, that you're saying, I know I could be anywhere in the world and work and be in peace and not worry about it, but I want to be here, be in the trenches with these women? Can you share with any stories with us?
Yes, lamentablemente el nivel de violencia de género en nuestro país es bien grande. Por consiguiente, es normal uno conocer de primera mano familiares, amigas, colegas que han sido víctimas de violencia de género y de violencia doméstica. Historias, inclusive en mi familia, por ejemplo, una historia que lamentablemente no tuvo un final feliz. Mi prima fue víctima de violencia de género, de feminicidio en la década de los 80. Fue secuestrada, agredida sexualmente y asesinada por 2 hombres que están cumpliendo cárcel. Pero también hay otras historias, ¿no?, de compañeras que han sido agredidas por sus compañeros, han sido agredidas sexualmente por sus compañeros y han salido a la luz pública, han denunciado estos eventos, y eso les ha brindado una plataforma para poder demostrar que la otra parte no está sola. Uno siempre piensa que este tipo de violencia ocurre a todos menos a uno. Y a través de la experiencia, ¿no?, de compartir en estos grupos, uno se da cuenta que uno mismo puede estar expuesta a este nivel de violencia. Mayormente está en nuestro campo una violencia doméstica, una violencia de género dirigida más al aspecto psicológico. Y en la actualidad, pues sí, conozco compañeras educadas, profesionales, que actualmente están luchando por romper el ciclo de violencia que viven.
Yes, unfortunately, in my country, there's a high level of gender-based violence, and it's not uncommon for people to know amongst their own family members, their friends, their colleagues, people who have been subjected to domestic violence or violence based on their gender. In my case, even in my family, I had a cousin who was in the 80s, who was a victim of femicide. She was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and killed by 2 men who were eventually, I think, put in jail, right? Others, though, there are many people or others who are still subjected to these kinds of things, these attacks and threats from their partners. both physical and psychological abuse. And people find that coming out publicly and speaking about these things provides a platform for people to realize that it can happen to anyone. It doesn't only become a problem for people of certain social status or whatever. So sharing in that is something that you realize. It can be amongst even our own academic colleagues. Some of them are fighting themselves right now to get out of this circle of violence and how to get away from it. So it happens to many people, and that's part of it.
Thank you very much. That was really a good explanation. So, what is it, do you think, in Puerto Rico now after Hurricane Maria? Do you think there is a discussion or thought or a plan to anticipate relationship between natural disasters and the impact it has on women? Is there any programs, any discussions, any political framework that are working towards that?
I wish I could say that the government has a plan in place, since we live in the Caribbean and eventually we're going to get hit by another hurricane. That's inevitable. But sadly, there is not, in a political, governmental level, there is not a plan in place. However, I think that after Hurricane Maria, this organization, ONG organization, have created a strong platform and communication between them that will facilitate and will be looking forward to prepare themselves in the eventual hurricane or another natural disaster to fight against the inevitable. And I think that that's really a good lesson that we had after Hurricane Maria. We have a saying in the island, is like, nos tenemos a nosotros mismos. No podemos esperar que el Estado responda. Nosotros, entre nosotros mismos. Y yo creo que eso ha quedado impregnado en nuestra sociedad, en las comunidades, que solamente nosotros nos salvamos con nosotros mismos, ¿no? Y yo creo que eso sí me da esperanza de que en un futuro no tengamos que pasar tantas necesidades como con el huracán María.
There was a government plan in place that I could say, like you asked about, in the Caribbean, because we're going to have more hurricanes and more disasters of this type because of where we live. But after Maria, the Hurricane Maria, the NGOs have developed like strong platforms where they have actually found ways to communicate amongst one another and facilitate being prepared for future such disasters that take place. And to fight for the inevitable. One of the things that characterizes us in Puerto Rico is that we talk about relying on one another. We have each other that we rely on. We're not going to wait for the state to solve the problem, because that's not going to happen. We will take the fight up ourselves to deal with the problems. Only we can save ourselves, basically, and that's the spirit that we have at this time from what we've learned, I guess.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad we arrived at that point. And that's the point I'm at right now, thinking that it's each and every one of us. If we wait, there is no superhero coming. We're not going to have a Superman flying in and fixing, whether the Superman is political leadership or people that have the money and financial capitals. Each and every one of us has to do their part, whether it's a man or a woman. And it's not a woman's issue, and it's not police's issue, and it's not the court's issue. It's all our issue. And until we get there, we're going to be struggling. And I'm really glad there are these small pockets of hopefulness. And I'm grateful to you that you were able to shine a light in that part of the world, so we can look at it and say it's not a woman's problem. It's not one country's problem. It's a global problem that we all need to advance status of women, so we can restore the social structure that's fair and equal for everybody. And I really am grateful for you joining me today. In this episode today, I was joined by Dr. Teresa Rodrigues-Lebron. Thank you, Dr. Teresa Rodrigues, for joining me.
Gracias a ustedes.
I would be remiss if I didn't thank for Margaret Villamizar for joining us and giving her time to interpret from Spanish to English. I am absolutely grateful to you to do that. And I also have to thank Gabby Mondaca for making this connection and connecting us so we can talk about this very important issue.